One of the key issues in the creation of propaganda is the use of data in stories, and telling them to different audiences in different contexts. You paraphrased Tuchtin-Hagen with the following text. Primary text in the context of Swiss historiography. Tuchtin-Hagen, 2011, suggested that in historiography an author's representativeness was measured according to his or her influence on contemporary and posterior historiography, as well as the author's reception in a general opinion building. This would be the case in the US, when talking about the most prominent historiographical popular writing in the last 40 years. Working people talk about what they do all day and how they feel about what they do. Written by DDipl. It had enormous impact on Americans and oral historians back in the 1970s.
Exactly. This is the mechanism of societal identity building. If the audience was successfully convinced of a story's message, they would perpetuate it by reproducing it in future stories.
Yes, I think this is very typical and shows how propaganda applied to communications can result in legend. This is clear demonstration how path dependence works.
Right.
However, I do not understand why you believe that even a story written by a computer included bias when you write. Such a story could in principle have been even written by a computer program. Despite its apparent objectivity, such a story was not free of bias. I guess you refer to the problem that the source data could be biased, then even a non-biased retelling of the story will present as biased.
No, that's not exactly what I discovered. The problem is not with the source data, and I dedicated much effort to strategies and techniques in avoiding such data bias in order to make visible how even unbiased data led necessarily to a biased story, always.
Is that so? Why?
This problem has very deep roots that go back to the synthetic geometry of reality. If you accept that reality is constructed in three interdependent dimensions, space, time, and subjectivity or acting, then you can conclude that a subject is dependent on the time and the place where it is localized actually. Thus, the telling of a story as a performance is constitutive for individual and social beings and is completely contextual, not only in the interpretation of data, but foremost in the propagandistic effects in its message. Stories must be always incomplete, given that reality cannot be presented in its totality, but only as a time and space-bound image, which on top of this is oriented towards a concrete and limited audience. Therefore, gaps are unavoidable, but the perception and the meaning of such gaps varies according to the audience who listen to the story.
This is the exact same debate that is currently ongoing with respect to the latest Steve Jobs film.
I think there are three different things which have to be considered separately. One is the question of audience and contextuality. I discussed it in relation to path dependence. The other one is the relationship between data, text, and medium within the context of artistic adaptations. And the third one is the problem of the intrinsic incompleteness in any form of representation of reality. This last one was also one of the most touching experiences I had throughout this research. The more I learned about the different personalities, which I later also used as characters in my story, the more reluctant I became to make any statements about them. In some way, we always miss something, distort it. Come on, using real people as characters is objectifying them. That is taking somehow their dignity. On the other side, if we do not tell their stories, we might forget and we have no possibility to honor them. It is a very small line. I do not know the book on which the film you mention was based, but independently from that, it would never be the same what Steve Jobs says directly to his people, or when it is reported in a book, even as direct speech or represented in a filmic adaptation. Each medium has its limitations and its impressions which are embodied in the action. For example, do we not have background music in real life interaction as in a film? But we have spatial and physical impressions, things like speaker-audience distance, perceived movements, temperatures, smells, which are completely lacking in the book or film. It is simply not the same to create tension by a sound, by a very close camera shot, or by sitting too close to somebody. Do you know what I mean?
So, this is question of media, not of context.
Certainly. Context, media, and metastructures of the mind are interrelated, but this is the aspect of media. Context is another question. For example, if Steve Jobs would say something socially acceptable in the US, but not outside the US, then the interpretation of the film would depend on the cultural background of the audience. The idea that the accomplishment of a common work could stay above the individual worker, for instance, might have been perceived very differently by a former generation than by the current Apple clients. However, I do not think that this was the core of the debate. It rather seems that the film producers adapted certain things in order to make it more effective on the screen, while still keeping it within the bounds of artistic license, as screenwriter Aaron Sorkin said. This is an aspect which is overlapping between audience, perception and translation into a different medium, the film. In fact, sometimes it is necessary to introduce elements which did not exist in real world, as for example background sound or a narrator, in order to create an atmosphere, an overall feel and message that are congruent with the original media. Honestly, I do not believe this was the case here. It rather seems, and excuses for changing the original message, that they simply wanted to make the story more action-driven and sensational. I think this is a tendency in mainstream film production at the moment, a kind of narrative decline. Good stories are made differently, but that is a different question.
Thank you, Dr. Hirzel.